Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen. Today's guest, Chris Masters, a man whose name is practically synonymous with the craft of investigative journalism, as his face was regularly beamed into living rooms across Australia when he worked on the ABC television program Four Corners between 1983 and 2010. One of his programs had a huge effect on my home state of Queensland. In 1987, Chris's report, The Moonlight State, led to the Fitzgerald Inquiry into corruption, which resulted in the deposition of the Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, as well as the jailing of 3 former ministers and the state's police commissioner, Terry Lewis. Chris has produced many remarkable stories across his career, but I make special mention of The Moonlight State, as this interview was recorded in late September while he was visiting Brisbane to launch All Fall Down, the third book in a trilogy about Queensland police corruption by Matthew Condon, a previous Penmanship guest. Condon said at the launch that his 3 books would not exist without the work of Chris Masters, which goes to show just how deeply his investigative journalism has affected so many people. I first met Chris at a Brisbane launch for his 2012 book, Uncommon Soldier, Brave, Compassionate and Tough, The Making of Australia's Modern Diggers. When I got a chance to speak to Chris afterwards, I told him that he'd been highly influential in my decision to pursue journalism, as when I graduated from the University of Queensland in 2009, Chris received a Doctor of Letters and gave a short speech, which I found immensely inspiring. When I later contacted Chris after that first meeting in 2012, he kindly sent me the text of his speech, which was even more affecting for me to read after having invested a few years in the business myself. Our conversation at Chris's hotel room overlooking the Brisbane River touches on the work ethic of his journalist mother, Olga Masters, and how that influenced Chris's own work. How an experience with death as a young man led to him becoming involved with a charity named Red Kite. How he goes about winning the trust of sources who are initially unwilling to speak with him. The 13 years of litigation which followed the broadcast of The Moonlight State. Why he believes that domestic investigative journalism is tougher than war zone reporting, and what sustains him after over 40 years in this business. Introducing Chris Masters, investigative journalist and author. Chris Masters, welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
We are in Brisbane in your hotel room overlooking the Brisbane River. It is lovely. You're here last night for a book launch, but tell me what else you're up to here in Brisbane.
The illustrious surrounds are not what I'm used to, I might say, in the beginning. Someone else paid for my trip here, so it's wonderful to have a view like this. I'm using the episode to subsidise a bit of work because I'm working on a book. It's about Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. So it's a difficult project. This is kind of what I'm conditioned to do the long form work and to go to the subject matter that isn't easily handled by the conventional 24 hours news cycle. And I'm confident that this is one of the toughest I've ever done, and that it would indeed be easier if I was writing a book about the Taliban.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like an extension of Uncommon Soldier.
It is.
Your last book.
It's a follow-up to Uncommon Soldier. I got to the end of Uncommon Soldier and felt there was a lot more public education to become involved with. Uncommon Soldier became a story about the modern soldier, the modern Australian soldier, and largely an introduction to the complexity of the Afghanistan mission. And in the course of working on that book, this is one thing about our business. Stories burgeon like yeast. You know, you get onto one story and you discover 3 or 4 others, and that's pretty much the path that led me to this book.
Yeah, your book Uncommon Soldier is great. I really enjoyed it, and as you described at several points in the narrative, one of the difficulties in the average Australian understanding what was going on over there is that it's difficult for the defence to allow reporters to know what's really going on. So your long-form embedded journalist kind of approach really benefited in that book, I suppose.
Thank you. Yes, I don't think that there's a simple way of telling the Afghanistan story. There's so much about the media that not only calls for politicians to give 3-word answers to everything, but it calls for us to be glib in our reporting too, that everything has to be reduced to 150 characters or whatever. And if there's one subject that resists simplification, it's the Afghanistan story. Yeah.
So SAS is the topic.
It's not well. It's Australian Special Forces. SAS is a component of Australian Special Forces.
I'm already revealing my lack of nuance and understanding around military.
That's right. That's nothing to be ashamed of. It's quite usual, but it is an important story, not only because of what it is, but because of the contemporary battlefield and the challenges that Australia faces in the future. I mean, Australia, along with all those allies, brought this mighty military machine to Afghanistan, and after all that blood and treasure, our longest war, 14 years on, you can hardly say it was a victory. So what do? You try to learn from what occurred, and because I think that for good or bad, that's pretty much the shape of the future too. If we do become involved in military operations, there'll be that style of operation.
Uncommon Soldier took you a couple of years of work, and that included a couple of Four Corners episodes where you travelled to Afghanistan to film with the military. Knowing that this process for this book will require a couple of years' work, was there any hesitation in embedding yourself in that world again?
There was. It's a good question. I reckon I have adopted something of the lawyer's cab-off-the-rank approach to stories. I mean, it's easy to cherry-pick and to just go looking for stories that will advance your own reputation. The low-hanging fruit, the easy stories to get. You have to estimate what you can do within the time frame you have. So I'm not saying that you don't pick the low-hanging fruit, but the conditioning that I had working in Four Corners for all those years and watching the way others worked was figuring over time that sometimes if a story presented itself to me and I knew that it was important, whether I wanted to do it or not, I would have to do it. So many times these stories appeared, and the sensible me may well have said, no, look, I need a break. And sometimes I suppose it's true, I did give myself a break. But when something like a Jonestown comes along, or something like this, I mean, to be honest with you, I was a little bit sick of soldiers and the military. Not so much Afghanistan. Afghanistan got under my skin a bit, but I was a bit sick of that world, and I'm definitely sick of hearing the phone ring out when I ring the Department of Defence, and when I seek sort of formal cooperation for something, and I have to be, and I feel like a spy or something. I feel like I'm being marginalised, or I'm sort of the enemy, whereas I'm just a representative of the Australian public, and these stories are supposed to belong to us all. So that part of it is exhausting, but I suppose I'm used to it too. That's kind of what you did at Four Corners every week.
Yes, investigative journalism is your bread and butter and has been for decades, and thank you for your work. I'm sure I'm not the only person in Australia who feels that way. We'll take a few steps back. Where did you grow up, Chris?
I grew up in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, not far from where we're sitting. My dad was a school teacher. My mum was a country journalist, and I think I learned a hell of a lot from my mum. My mum's a writer and quite, established on the Australian literary scene. She was a very good provincial and regional journalist too. One of the great lessons that she taught me and my siblings was the best stories occur in the human heart. We lived in Urbanville. You probably haven't heard of Urbanville, but Mum was the stringer for the Northern Star in Urbanville, and Mum pumped out story after story after story, despite the fact that nothing ever happens in Urbanville and ever has happened in Urbanville. But that didn't stop her, and maybe that training was helpful to me too in investigative journalism. Because when I started out, I was attracted to the country lifestyle, having grown up. My dad was being a school teacher. I lived in a lot of smaller regional communities, and I think I liked the social controls of smaller town life. And my wife also came from a country town, so we were pretty keen to live in the country. And as soon as I got my first job at the ABC, it was at a regional radio station. And when I think back, I think probably the best training I ever had as an investigative journalist was waking up in a place where nothing happened, because it really made you get out there and find stories. And you never ever said, well, nothing's going on, it's a slow news day. And I don't like hearing that. I don't like hearing the slow news day thing. I don't like hearing the good get thing, as if it's about waiting for it all to come to us, So I really learned to get out there. I think it helped me too in terms of my ethical approach to the work. I think that you calibrate your moral compass a lot better in a place where you confront your audience every day, when they'll appear angry at the desk and say, why did you say this? It makes you a bit more disciplined, a bit more careful. And I don't think it makes you more cowardly. I suppose it could, but I think some of the most noble journalism I know of occurs in those smaller communities where every now and then the local editor, not that we have too many of them anymore, but when they say, no, look, I know you mightn't want this story, but I reckon we need it.
I'm guessing it was a household where reading and writing were prized commodities or prized traits and values.
Yes, I know. I mean, lots and lots of things happened in those days that I, with maturity, value in a way that I never could at the time. I grew up in a progressive household, and I never knew that. My parents were close to the local Indigenous community when the Hungarian doctor came to the town and was shunned by the matron who'd run the hospital and shunned by so many of the rest of the community. My parents embraced him and their family. So there was lots of terrific conditioning for the future. I of course, the most powerful character in my family was my mother, So I think that all sorts of gender equity values were being inculcated without me ever realising it. Yes, I mean, I could read very well before I started school. Can well remember pulling the books down out of the shelves. There wasn't much else to do either. I don't think there was. We even listened to radio in those days. So a hell of a lot of reading. And my mum was a very keen reader, and she had a terrific library. And as I say, it took me a long time to appreciate what a fantastic education I was getting without even going near the local school.
Purely by osmosis, being close to your mother with her great work ethic, which I'm guessing might have translated into your career. You seem to have had a fantastic work ethic yourself.
Yeah, all of the masters, lots of us, most of us work in the media, and that's true of all my siblings. And even patterns of work are very similar. Mum used to get up at about 4 a.m. You'd hear the sloshing of the bath. You'd hear the kettle turned on, and you'd hear the rattle of the typewriter. And those sounds now accompany the start to my day as well. I find that I wake up fresh and keen, and I find that my mental energy starts to fade a little bit by lunchtime. I find I sort of get a lot of writing done earlier in the day, and then I find my mother used to bang away at the typewriter, and then it'd stop, and you'd hear the door slam, and she'd walk off, and that was an absolute routine. And what was happening was it was time to stop writing and to start thinking, to come up with an idea. And that's how she did it. It's funny how hard it is to have a good idea when you're sitting down. And then she'd go up to the butcher shop, and she'd get into a conversation with any number of people along the way, because she was good at that. And she'd come back energized and with not one but 3 or 4 new ideas.
Yeah, tell me a bit more about your siblings. It's quite extraordinary how the progression has gone from your mother through to her children.
Well, most of us write in a way for a living. My oldest brother Roy's a sports reporter. There's 7 of us too, prolific in all sorts of ways. Ian is the second born, and he does a radio show in Los Angeles. Google him, Ian Masters, and he's quite well known over there. He does a radio show called Background Briefing. He's a kind of a left-wing shock jock. I know you didn't think they existed. A public radio, not really a shock jock. And then Quentin is a filmmaker. He now lives in Spain, but he set up a very successful film company in London. He left Australia quite young, and he basically made commercials. He made a few movies. There's a few movies that I could name that you'd probably know that he directed, but he wasn't that interested in directing movies. He was much more of a business person. Surprises me, because I don't think we had any business skills in the family, but he certainly has them. And then Sue, I'm the middle one. I'm number 4. Sue's number 5, and she's got a big drama CV. She works now at SBS. She was the head of drama at Network 10. She was the head of drama at the ABC. She's made lots of well-known Australian TV shows, like Sea Change and that sort of thing. And then Deb is the producer of, executive producer of Australian Story. And she was also the executive producer of that brilliant series that was done with Sarah Ferguson, The Killing Season. Cool. And she's done a lot of those. So Deb is, I think it's fair to say, Deb's probably the ABC's best TV producer. She's off camera. And my youngest brother, Michael, died of a heroin overdose.
What age?
Back in 1988, at about the age of 28.
Right. I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, well, it's a sad story. It's scarred the family, but it's, and you would know this, having written what you've written, that it's not that uncommon a story either.
Yeah, that's right. Were you a good student in school?
No, I was not a good student. I was thought to be very bright in my primary years, and I think I got a bit lazy about scholarship. Then I was also short-sighted and didn't know it.
Huh.
And I didn't sort of wear glasses until I was about in my mid-20s. I was in my 20s before I knew I was short-sighted.
Wow. You just thought that was normal?
Yeah.
Wow.
Why would you think otherwise? When I think back, there were a couple of occasions where I should have twigged and my parents should have twigged. But yeah, I think that actually didn't help me much,
You walked around squinting a lot.
Not seeing what was on the blackboard and that sort of thing.
Yeah, wow. Huh.
Anyway, and then the other thing that happened that did not help my my schooling was we left Lismore in the Northern Rivers when I was about 15 and moved to Sydney, and I think in that at Lismore High and other places like that I kind of got away with not doing a lot of work. I couldn't get away with it once I got to the city, and I fell behind and didn't cope with that very well. So I sort of don't count those years as my better years for sure, by a long shot, and regret them too, because I think I'd be a much better journalist if I was better educated. It wasn't until I was really in my 20s that I sort of developed a bit of discipline and rediscovered some scholarship.
Was university an option?
Well, I mean, my marks when I left high school weren't good enough for me to even get into university, but I did, as a mature age student, do some university study, and that helped me a little bit. But to this day, I regret that I didn't do a good degree.
What was the first money you ever earned?
Well, I remember getting about $4,000 a year. I've been lucky when it comes to money. I've always had a job. I've never been out of a job, and even though most of my career I wasn't on big money, I was on a public service salary, and in 1983, when I started at Four Corners, I was on about $30,000, but then I quickly established a very strong reputation at the ABC and in our field, and so I rose to the top of the scale. But even so, I was still on around about $30-something thousand a year, which wasn't a lot of money when you consider my commercial colleagues were on $300,000 or $400,000 a year. Mm-hmm. I worked briefly in commercial television in the late 80s and was on a lot of money then. I was on a lot of money for about 18 months, but I count it in terms of the cost benefit and the balance sheet of my own life. I count it as one of the bad economic moves, actually, because I made a lot of money, but it was short-lived. Developed a few bad habits that I could have done without, and lost all of the benefits that you get from tenure in the public service.
What about as a teenager, though? Did you have like a part-time job or some cheap way?
Yeah, when I see these ads at the moment for people who've worked at Woolworths, I think, I could be one of them. I worked at Woolworths. I wasn't a checkout chick, but I used to sort of cart the bags out to the boot of the car and things like that and put stuff on shelves. Now, look, I worked for a vet, on a chicken farm. That was dreadful. And that's what you sort of did in those days. I think everybody did it. You always had some sort of job. After school, I worked in a pharmacy,
Why was it dreadful, the chicken job?
It was an awful boss. It was a chicken farm. The treatment of the animals was awful. Everything about it was miserable. Mm-hmm. But it's just one of the many jobs
that you do.
That's right.
Yes. Well, what was the? Did you aspire to be a journalist? Did you aspire to follow in your mother's footsteps?
Yes, I did. I think about this a little bit too, because I think that when I was at school, you've already had me confess what a bad student I was. The one thing that I was naturally good at was English, and so it was kind of always presumed that I would do something like journalism, or I would do something like cartooning. I also went to art school, and so many of my colleagues from that era were much the same. Kerry O'Brien, Andrew Ollie, good friends. They pretty much came out of high school. There weren't too many people who actually went to university who were, if you look at the senior journalists of that era, people like Ray Martin and Mike Carlton were foreign correspondents in places like Jakarta and New York, and so many of us didn't really. We came straight out of high school and got a cadetship. That was the route that you took. Not everybody.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there were no journalism courses offered at university at that time.
No, there weren't. No, they weren't. And the cadetship was the way you learned journalism. You learned it on the job, and you tended to be sent off to a out of the way place, where you make your mistakes in somewhat comparative obscurity, and then you work your way up the ladder. That's how I did it. How Richard Carlton did it. How Tony Joyce did it. How Andrew Ollie did it. Do you know what? I look back on it and I think it must have been a pretty good system, because there was a kind of natural selection of people who had, if not the aptitude, the appetite for the work. And that is critical. You have to want to do it. You have to get excited about whatever story it is that you're commissioned to do. So we didn't have a lot of formal education, but I think we were all really interested in what we were doing. And I know that years down the track, when journalism required a 98 TER, and there were journalism courses everywhere, and lots of attractive young women wanted to be Jana Wendt, and you're getting people coming into the job with great education. Sometimes they'd come along with me on a shoot, doing work experience or something, and sometimes I thought they were terrific, and I always understood how lucky we were to have this new cohort, this keen and better educated cohort with lots of other skill sets. But if they weren't interested in telling the story, they weren't much good. Didn't matter whether they could speak 5 languages and had an economics degree. If you were if you were asked to do a story about tax reform, I remember this happening one time. This young woman saying to me, "What are you doing? What's this story you're doing?" And I think it was on transfer pricing. And I told her, and she said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Because it's important." And but she wasn't a little bit interested in it. So if she didn't get that notion that that is the job, to make what is important interesting, then I couldn't see her really doing all that well.
That's a good point about making the important interesting, because you can present the facts dryly and people will switch off almost instantly, especially around topics like tax reform. But if you can use your intelligence and your understanding of the form to shape it in a way that gets people thinking and engage themselves, that's the difference between a good journalist and a great one, I think.
And that's the critical element. That's what sets so many really good reporters apart. An enthusiasm for the work and a willingness to take on any story, and a recognition that the key component is actually within. It isn't necessarily the good break. It is your own ability to see your way through the story and form the narrative. There's a commercial television reporter called Chris Reason, and he's phenomenally good at what he does in that little world, and I think that's why when he turns up on a job, he just sees things that other people don't.
Landing that job at the ABC cadetship, was that correct? Your first job at the ABC?
It was similar. It was a kind of a regional cadetship, yeah.
What were your expectations or aspirations from that first moment in television, or in journalism rather?
Look, I would have had the aspiration to go to a program like Four Corners, because I know my parents used to watch it, and I knew the program well, and it would have been the benchmark for me. But to be frank, I don't think I even allowed myself to think that I would ever actually work there. and my horizon at the beginning wasn't much more than living and working in a place like Albury or Rockhampton or Tamworth or something like that, and doing local radio. But your life turns on unexpected moments, and I was actually in Rockhampton, and I was the manager of the radio and television station up there, and I wasn't yet 30, so I hadn't done too badly career-wise, but I wasn't really that interested in management. I was interested, you had two paths you trod at the same time. One was the news side of it, and one was the management side of it. And I knew that I didn't want to be a manager for the rest of my days, and I certainly did want to. Did want to stay in the news industry, and I had a cousin who was actually also in Rockhampton at the time, who was a very good local reporter. This was just a coincidence, and he was very keen on staying in the one spot. He was very keen on being that noble country town reporter, and he used to talk to me about it. But I found I wasn't as good as he was at doing the same story over and over. I obviously started to get a bit restless, and I started to feel a little bit trapped. And I started to wonder, because the good stories, the big stories that are of interest to the national media, only come your way once in a while, and when they do, there's a tribe of reporters come in and take. So I wasn't doing a bad job, but I wasn't really making any kind of impression where it mattered, in terms of your career anyway, back in Sydney or Brisbane. But as I say, your life turns on some unexpected moments, and my daughter got very ill, and so I had to move to the city for the sake of her awful circumstance, and so I was out of a job. My daughter got cancer. She's only 3 years old. I'm living in a cancer ward, and I've got another daughter. My wife's bereft, and I'm out of work. So I got another job, and I got a job with the rural branch of the ABC. That's where I was known, because I was in Rockhampton and Albury and Tamworth and places like that. I filed a lot of material for ABC Rural, and so they took me on down there, and I worked on programs like Countrywide and A Big Country, and that's how I came to Four Corners. Amazing. It amazes even me. But I obviously had very good training in the country. I did better in television than I did in radio. I had an eye for a story as well as a mind for it. I don't know why, but I could tell stories with pictures. I seemed to have a natural aptitude for that. And so when I was working on Countrywide, being sent out to do little stories, I got noticed, and at the same time, the new executive producer of Four Corners wanted to change the program. He was a POM, but he wanted to de-pomify it. Jonathan Holmes, whom of course you'd know.
Of course. He
came in, very bright guy, super bright guy, and he came from the British program Panorama. Panorama's the oldest current affairs show in the world, and Four Corners is the second oldest, continually running one. Anyway, there was a bit of an old guard. It was like an elephant's graveyard at Four Corners. There were a lot of sort of statesman-like reporters who were very good at what they did, but they were much more interested in essays and analysis. They weren't very good at news reporting. They wrote very well. They could make good films, but they tended to be interested in subject matter like public schools versus private schools, and they weren't bedded in the reality of the day, and their mindset was much more embedded in the past. And Jonathan wanted to change all that, so he wanted a new breed of reporter, and he actually wanted reporters who sounded Australian. It's funny how it took a poem to recognise that, the importance of that.
Right.
And so that's how I got the job.
Uh-huh. When you were first starting in journalism, did your mother give you any tips on reporting?
Well, the main one is the one that I have mentioned already, which was that you let the story look for you as much as you look for it. You don't turn away from difficult stories if they're important, and you develop your craft. You know, you take on work that means that whatever you do, you advance your own reputation. You don't just take a job because it will make you famous or get you paid a lot more money. You take a job that you will do really well and improve your own currency in the meantime.
Why do people talk to journalists, Chris?
I'm surprised sometimes. I think that people want to tell their story. People want their story told, even if they say they don't. I've found there are some things in journalism that we hate doing, like the dreaded death knock, for example, when you go and ask parents how they feel after they've lost a precious child. Somewhat to my surprise, I found as often as not that they were keen to tell their story, because think about it, you know, do they really want their child to be forgotten? Do they really want that story to just vanish without trace? They want some things that matter to live on. They want us to take notice. So I think it's a very important job, and I actually think it's a underrated and misunderstood job. That I was saying as we were talking last night about the genesis of the Fitzgerald Inquiry, and I was talking about the work that Matthew Condon's done recently in chronicling so much of the detail that connects to that seminal event. And who else is going to do that work? Who else is going to go out and find those witnesses? You know, the public does not have the patience, particularly in the digital age, to wait for the evidence to assemble so that somebody can sit in the library and write it all down. We actually need the first draft as well. And that first draft has been delivered for centuries now by working journalists. And working journalists are all about primary evidence. If you're getting stuff off the internet, it's already been published, you know. So I think I like to think that I'm much more than a collator. I'm a discoverer of information. And that means going into people's homes. It might mean going back to their homes 20 times, because I don't know how many times over the years people have said to me, I'll talk to you off the record maybe, but I don't want you to quote my name. And I sit down and I talk with them, and they give me a little bit, and then I come back and they give me a little bit more. And after the 10th or 15th visit, and of course I'm revealing that the work that I've done, investigative work, is luxurious by the standards of the conventional working journalist. You know, you can only do long form journalism if you've got a lot of time to do it, and a lot of time to build that trust. But anyway, after that long process, when they start to trust you, the only way you get their trust is to genuinely earn it, and they start to feel that you're in this story with them, then often as not, they want to put their name to it. And that's happened to me many times.
Yes. Just on that subject of death knocks, I do need to ask, what happened to your daughter?
My daughter died of cancer. She had a very rare retinoblastoma. We lived in Rockhampton at the time, and the local doctor misdiagnosed it, because why would you expect him to see something that happens in 1 in 37 million children? And he thought she had a turned eye. My wife knew better. And anyway, eventually when an eye surgeon looked at little Alice, we had to swiftly bolt to Sydney and have the eye removed, and unfortunately it was too late.
I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah, no, but it was a long time ago, and you never think that any good will come of something like that, and it was a brutal experience for us all. Still think about Alison quite a lot, but I became a director of the Red Kite charity, which I helped to set up here in Queensland, and it's a very good charity because it provides services to people who are caught in that particular circumstance. So we're not sort of paying for holidays to Disneyland. We're not doing all the things that tug at the heartstrings. We're doing the real important practical stuff, like paying for Granny to fly in and help look after the siblings and stuff like that.
Mm. Was that your first experience with death?
Yes, it probably was. And I must say, you're very good at getting me to say things I wouldn't normally say. I sometimes think to myself how awful it is for me, for the first dead person I saw to be my own daughter.
Mm.
After that, I saw lots of dead people, and the ones that I remember are the children. I am haunted by the look and the face of small children, and of course, like I think our nation was virtually traumatized recently by that image of the toddler on the beach in Turkey, and with the face turned away, so it became the face of every child, and dressed in familiar clothing that we're familiar with, and so when I was working in Rwanda and I was moving amongst piles and piles of dead bodies, I can conjure the images up easily of what I saw, and it's always the faces of the children.
Did that experience with Alice change the trajectory of your work in any particular way?
It might have. It might have made me a bit tougher about I don't really know for sure, but if you go through something like that, I don't think it made me meaner. I don't think I've ever been a mean reporter. I've certainly hurt people. You can't practice thorough journalism without hurting people, but I always wanted to be fair about it, and I always felt that fairness was a strength. So that sort of old tough fair scenario was one that's always been attractive to me. But maybe the very fact that I'd experienced a tough situation of my own, maybe that made me capable of surviving further difficult experiences.
Was that your first child?
My second child, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've got an older daughter who now is a speechwriter for Mike Baird.
Oh, wow.
Hmm.
Okay, thank you for talking to me about Alice. I know it's not particularly pleasant.
Didn't expect to talk about Alice, but I don't want to not talk about Alice. It's, she really existed, and that's something I've always said about that experience, that it goes something to the story of what we're saying about the death knocks. if there's any comfort at all, it's in hanging on to those memories. You don't want to forget. There's lots that you don't want to forget.
Last night on the panel, you talked a bit about winning the trust of sources, which you mentioned a few minutes ago. And on the panel last night was your Deep Throat, one of your major sources for the Moonlight State, your landmark report for Four Corners. And Peter himself mentioned that he was quite reluctant to speak with you at first. Tell me more about that process of the winning the trust of someone whose input will in some ways make or break a story.
It was good in a way that, that just as there's a network of corrupt cops who seem to have an antennae for one another, there's also a network of good ones who equally trust one another. And why do you do that? Well, you just spend time with them, you sit with them, you clearly share similar values, and that trust over time grows. And I think the same thing has to occur. I think you do form a bond. Whether or not you can call that friendship is another question. Sometimes you do become friends as well. Sometimes the relationship is more businesslike, but it's still equally built on trust. But it takes a time. It takes a while, and I think in my case, they couldn't ignore my genuine enthusiasm. I am sincere about my interest in the story and my approach to my work, and I think that becomes obvious. There are some things you just can't lie about. There's a lot of mischief and a lot of cat and mouse stuff that happens in the course of persuading reluctant witnesses to do things. And I've seen a lot of shenanigans, and I'm not even going to deny that I haven't played that cat and mouse game myself, because you have to be smart when you're aiming for the truth, whatever that happens to be. Telling a lot of lies along the way isn't obviously going to help you. Mm-hmm. But when you're dealing with people who tell lies for a living, you've got to be clever yourself, and so I'm not going to admit that I've ever engaged in obvious deception. And indeed, when people would say to me, "What's in it for me, Chris?" and I would say, "Well, just the opportunity to be a good citizen," I'd see them laugh, and I'd even laugh myself sometimes. But I kind of meant it to, and mostly it didn't work. But persistence mattered a lot, and I think actually after a while, when I started to do programs that really did make a difference and that were difficult programs, people thought were going to go down the gurgle hole but didn't, then the door opened a lot wider. I got overwhelmed indeed with whistleblowers and people sort of pushing stories on me and wanting me to do stories, and the great majority of them I had to resist.
You became like a magnet drawing in whistleblowers because they saw that you were some crusader for the truth in your work.
That's right, yeah. And I didn't actually enjoy that at all. I mean, I found it quite exhausting, to be honest with you. And I have a kind of an unusual view of whistleblowers. People often see them as saintly, and some of them really are. You saw a couple last night that deserve a huge amount of credit. But there are also a lot of them that just simply want to join you in their obsessions and are particularly single-minded and can't see the other side of the story, and start to get really angry with you if you start to balance the facts. So my rule of thumb that I developed over time for dealing with whistleblowers to find them rather than have them find me. So a lot of the whistleblowers that I've worked with, a bit like Peter Vassallo, he didn't put his hand up and say, I'm a whistleblower. You know, I actually had to find him and talk to him and encourage him to believe that I was as interested in this sort of stuff as he was. And some sort of alliance was formed.
And what a powerful alliance it was, ultimately.
Yeah.
What was it like last night to be on a stage where, yes, it's a book launch for Matthew Condon's latest book, but as he himself said at the beginning, these 3 books would not have existed without the Moonlight State, which was your work. What was it like to be in Queensland, in Brisbane, the premiere sitting in the front row? It's, 25 years after that program went to air, maybe more. What was that? What were you thinking when you were on stage, when you weren't speaking, of course?
I did have a few thoughts that you want to drink in the moment, because it is a special moment. The first thought I had was how I could never have anticipated this. One thing that actually didn't come out too much last night was how it didn't all end when Fitzgerald began. Triggering the Fitzgerald Inquiry was a win for some of those players there, but life was still extremely awkward. The Fitzgerald Inquiry had to play out. I had 13 years of litigation that I had to confront, which was the hardest thing I've ever done in my career. Peter Vassallo's career, his own career, was in question. He was, because he was exposed as a whistleblower, he as much as he came close to getting the sack, took a while for it to be revealed that he was substantially right about Terry Lewis and others. Kingsley Fancourt's career was already down the gurgler at that stage. Jim Slade had a brief period in the sun, but he had a lot of tough times too, because he was going to be loathed by so many of his colleagues in the Queensland Police, who's for his role in bringing it all undone. Even the good ones, the ones who didn't take money, could still be angry at the whistleblowers because the exposition damaged their own reputation. People in supermarkets were joking, if they wore a uniform, that they were crooks and stuff like that. So that old story that the exposing one bad apple contaminates everybody, and that's unfair. I've never gone along with that argument, but still in all, it's not going to be an easy time for anybody when a major reform swings into action.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I do want to ask about the 13 years of litigation, but before that, I wondered if you could tell me about the process of getting the Moonlight State approved by the ABC's legal department before going to air.
Well, I'd begun work on the program in September 86, and it went to air in April 87. The normal turnaround for a 4 weeks for a Four Corners program is about 6 weeks. So, I certainly burned my 6 weeks over and over again. I used to position my bigger inquiries over the Christmas break because it gave me a hiatus and more time to... Sometimes, you'll ring somebody and say, would you consider talking to me? And it might take them 4 weeks to even answer your phone call, or 4 weeks to think about it, or whatever. So you need that hiatus, and I used to get it. I found that I got it over that break. So I'd position big inquiries towards the end of the year. And then we came back in January and I started work on it, and the horizon just kept shifting. We started to get reasonably good material, but we needed more, then we needed more, then we needed more. And after a while, when it looked like this could be a strong report, the lawyers become involved, and they need more, and they need more. They keep asking for further proof, and as much as that's frustrating, you want to get it right before you go to air rather than afterwards, and so I've often said it's like a glacier. You see the tip of the iceberg, but you don't see all that work underneath, and there's so much of that work is about satisfying the lawyers so that they can say that you can defend the program at the end of the day. That was always a line ball exercise, and there were some frustrating conversations, and I can remember the lawyers saying to me, you say this is a brothel, how can you prove that? And I'm saying, well, what do you mean? But they do make it very, very hard for you, and but I'm glad that I was subjected to that process, because I was subjected to far worse later.
What happened after that program went to air?
Well, the skies shook. The phone rang off its hook. I was already exhausted, and I was not at all optimistic. I'd been through this sort of thing before. I'd made a program that had triggered a Royal Commission back in '83, and it can be a brutal time, and it can be a demoralising time. And so I wasn't enthusiastic, and I'd seen the way Queensland had operated in the past, where they just slaughter the whistleblowers, attack the messengers. There were so many things that were happening at the same time that I didn't know about that worked in my favour. I didn't know that Bjelke-Petersen's tenure was under threat from his own people. I didn't know that I knew something about the national dimension to the Queensland police corruption problem. I knew that the National Crime Authority and the Federal Police had concerns about it, but I don't think I knew the extent of those concerns. So in short, I didn't know how many secret allies there really were. I didn't know how keen the Brisbane legal establishment was to get to the bottom of this and to get it right, because I think that they'd been through a few inquiries in the past and were smarting over the quiet belief that the wool had been pulled over their eyes. They'd been outsmarted by the cops on a couple of occasions, the National Hotels Inquiry and others. And so there was a lot more energy for getting it right than I could have been aware of. But for all that, didn't know much about that, was dragging my heels when I went back up to Queensland. Felt that I'd have to be tough. And I'd have to do my best to protect the witnesses that I had managed to persuade to stick their necks out. I had been a little bit of experience had taught me to withhold some evidence. When I'd been working on the cops story, and I had my kind of who's who of the rogues gallery, who the crooks were. And I figured the way that it would probably go, because I'd seen it before, was that yes, some middle level cop might be hung out to dry, and it's all his fault, to let the administration off the hook. So, anticipating something like that, I had a little bit of evidence that I could then reveal, and sort of kept it up my sleeve, but was pretty keen for them to know that I knew about it too, So this, I guess, this is part of the cat and mouse stuff that we were talking about. Anyway, it wasn't a fun time, and it's not actually fun being at work, because they just want you to go back to work. There's another schedule that
6 weeks
is instantly upon you.
Yep.
So 6 weeks later, you're supposed to be on air again, and I wasn't that popular in the unit because I'd taken so much time to do this program. You you rely on the goodwill of your colleagues, and it's great when you work in a unit where there's a range of skills at play. Not everybody wants to do the investigative work. And there are other programs you can make at a program like Four Corners, programs that are interview based, programs that are much more like films, lyrical, documentary style type programs. So not everybody does the investigative work, and if everybody's trying to do it, then you kind of lose your way a little bit, because there aren't the resources to service every single person on the floor. I'd stretched the friendship a bit and it wasn't something that I did deliberately or did lazily. But yes, I had to take that into account. And at the end of the year, journalism is still about volume rather than quality. Journalists are still well regarded by their peers and by the management if they do a lot of work. They fill a lot of column space, if they're more prolific. And they actually kind of like them too if they do what they're told to do, rather than people like me who kept saying, no, this is the important story we ought to do. I don't know that I was all that popular on the floor. And at the end of that year, I did 3 programs in 1987.
The whole year?
And the whole year.
Right.
In Four Corners talk, 5 or 6 is at least what would be expected, and a very productive reporter might do 7. I did 3, but they were probably 3 of the best programs I ever made.
You mentioned this last night in the panel, and I want to touch on it again here today. What did the absence of Police Commissioner Terry Lewis do for that story?
I think it was better that he wasn't in the program. Matt Condon says that he says he made a mistake by not agreeing to be interviewed. We are obliged to offer them right of reply, and yes, and usually the major interview wouldn't be done until the last week. So in the last week, I was asking him to be interviewed. I was offering up a list of questions. It wasn't a list of false questions either. It was the questions that I was going to ask, if not in precise detail, at least the headings were right. And, it's a bit like a lawyer in a witness box. You're not going to telegraph exactly what you're going to ask, but you can't lie about why you want to do the interview. And he replied at the time saying that this outline was too vague for him to take seriously. I didn't expect him to do the interview, and I'm glad he didn't do the interview, because by that stage your program's pretty much assembled. I don't expect him to tell the truth. So, why do I want to have somebody to come on who's just going to dissemble and lie, But if he'd done that, he would have emasculated the program. I would have had to remove so much evidence to contain that interview. And, I would have been obliged to run it, because it would have been unfair not to.
So his absence made the program stronger?
I think so, yeah.
And what triggered the 13 years of litigation? Who brought that?
Essentially, there were a few litigants. Vincenzo Bellino was the senior one. He was the Cairns-based Bellino brother. The program was mostly about Brisbane and, the Gold Coast to some degree. But yes, it sort of speared off and looked at Vincenzo Bellino in Cairns as well, because of that original undercover police inquiry by Jim Slade had looked at the far north as well, and so I had some of that evidence, and and I didn't let go of it. In some respects, looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight, I might have been better off without it. Don't know whether that would have stopped me being sued. But we had one trial, and we won the first trial, and I had to carry that pretty much on my own too. I was about our only witness. And I didn't feel like I was a witness just defending the program. I was in defending investigative journalism and the news industry and the Courier Mail. I was defending the worth of a program like the Moonlight State. I mean, imagine the outcome if that program had been knocked to bits. Imagine the impact on the rest of the industry. Everybody would say, well, it certainly raised a few eyebrows at the time, but look at the trouble it got them into. We better not do that again. So anyway, we won the first trial. After that was a horrible exercise.
Because it was detracting from your other work and
Yes.
putting stress on you and I suppose your
stress.
family.
I call it my death by 1,000 courts, and it nearly killed me. It certainly made me. It dissolved my faith in the worth of journalism. I didn't want to find my career hijacked. I mean, turned into a professional witness, a defendant. My unit didn't like me because I was always away. I was always miserable. I was always having to handle these court matters. The thing had started in 1986. It was still going by the year 2000. Meanwhile, everybody I'd worked with on the original program had moved on. So I'm alone in the unit, still defending stuff. I've got a new boss who, for him, the Moonlight State is already ancient history. It's just annoying that I'm having to go away all the time. So they didn't do much to relieve the stress. The ABC legal department were fantastic, and I'm from that era where I can still remember what it's like for an organisation to stand on principle and provide the funds to fight on principle. There's been a lot of reforms to defamation law over the years, and it's not nearly as tough now as it was. But a good thing about that era was that the editorial principle mattered. Now it's pretty much the economic principle is the only principle that matters, and you'll find yourself in a situation where you'll be sued and you'll feel like you've got a substantial defence to the writ, but for all that, it's going to be settled because otherwise the costs will go through the roof.
What the hell sustained you throughout that 13 years?
I mean, I couldn't. I was trapped too. There really wasn't another option for me but to keep going. And I suppose because it was a Four Corners program, it kept me at Four Corners.
Right.
I still like the work, and I was learning some tricks when it came to self-preservation. I always felt like I had to take on hard stories, but while this was going on, it was the hard story. And so the work I did through the 90s suffered a fair bit because of all that litigation. But, I still went off and covered Rwanda and still covered Bosnia, and I still did some pretty good work. And I think that I just felt that I didn't have any option. But psychologically, I had to find something to sustain me because it was driving me crazy, and it was making me an awful, awful person to be around.
Right.
I was perpetually miserable. I was obsessive. It was on my mind all the time. I felt such a victim. You know how boring victims can be. I would moan and moan and moan, and I could see people turning away from me. And so I knew that I had to find a way to stop behaving this way. And I came to see that this burden of litigation was like a disability. People who have a disability have to. The psychological crutch for them is to stop feeling sorry for themselves and get on with their life, and that's pretty much what I had to do.
Was your wife supportive throughout that process?
She was, yeah. She's
one of few supporters during that whole process?
I don't feel like I had too many supporters through that process. You know, even the people that I'd worked closely with, I think they got a bit annoyed with me too. I had supporters among the legal community. Started out, you know, having a love-hate relationship with lawyers, which I suppose probably sustains to this day. But yeah, if I feel like I was in the trenches with anybody, it was with the lawyers. People like Rob Mulholland here in Queensland.
What was the moment where it was all done?
Well, it fizzled rather than it banged. You know, there were the victories in the 2 trials in North Queensland were great moments along the way. But don't forget, I had other cases as well. A lot of reporters feel like it's their solemn duty to never be sued, and some others feel the exact opposite. You know, it's the job to get in there and have a good blue and take a few risks. Mm-hmm. Now, I was in the latter camp, and one of the programs that I'd made here in Queensland called Lawyers, Drugs and Money also got me sued. And that was a battle royal here, with the Courier Mail barking at me the whole way. Then I'd made another program because in the late 80s I worked for about 18 months for Channel 10, and I was unlucky enough to be sued while I was there working for a program that was short-lived, which meant that when the writ appeared, my protection was gone. The indemnity that we commonly have when we work for an employer, because we're the second defendant. They sue the broadcaster, then they sue the reporter. And in my case, for the Channel 10 defamation action, Channel 10 didn't exist anymore. The entity that was Channel 10 when I worked for them went out of business. So I lost my indemnity, so I had to defend it myself. This was all happening at the same time as all the Moonlight State stuff.
Wow.
And I haven't even told you all of them, there were more. But
Jeez, Chris.
But you know, so everything was under threat. You know, I wasn't a wealthy person, and I'm still not a wealthy person, but whatever I had, everything that I'd worked for, you know, the mortgage, the rattly old car, you know, I was going to lose it all. You know, the arithmetic was it was going to cost you. They were seeking $500,000 damages, and the cost of litigation would be about $500,000. So I didn't have anything like that money, and yet I had to find a way to defend myself. I better tell you one other critical, key piece of information with respect to this story, and that is I was also wrong. You know, yeah, I had made a mistake. This happens in journalism.
Yes.
You can't do pain-free journalism, and I don't think you can do mistake-free journalism either. I know Stuart Littlemore thinks you can, but no, I don't even think Stuart can do mistake-free journalism. So I had made a mistake, and so I was extremely vulnerable, and it took a long time to sort that one out. And I wasn't the only one sued. Like they sued everybody that appeared on the credits. And so
really? Everybody?
Everybody.
Oh, yeah.
So many of the colleagues that I worked with who were also sued, you know, who had nothing to do with the mistake, that they were also at risk, and no matter what they said to their wives, etc., their partners, it's okay, you know, Chris will do the right thing. Their wives and partners weren't necessarily going to believe that. And so they were being persuaded to counter-sue me.
Oh, jeez.
I remember coming out of a war zone in Kosovo, and it was like the scenes you see on TV now with all the refugees sort of flooding the borders. I was sort of caught up in one of those circumstances, and the phone rang, and it was my cameraman telling me that his lawyer had advised him to counter-sue me, and that was a low point in the middle of a war zone, to try to talk my cameraman out of counter-suing me.
This sounds like a fertile breeding ground for depression.
Yeah.
Did you have depression at any point during that process?
Look, I might have. My wife's a psychologist. If you asked her, you'd get a better answer. I do have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I only know this by accident, because I went along to see a psychologist on my wife's recommendation because I was having trouble sleeping. I've never thought that I suffered PTSD. I just think I've lived a crowded life, and all these things, these memories I have of dead children, etc., I think that that's absolutely normal. I don't see it as a disorder. I think that it'd be wrong if I didn't have those memories, and I think I manage those memories quite well, and I don't hide them, and I'm talking about them right now, as I do, if anybody's silly enough to ask me. And but the psychologist said to me, "You tick all the boxes." Anyway, I continue to resist the idea that I have post-traumatic stress disorder, or at least I certainly resist the disorder, the D acronym.
What do you think is the impetus for that? Is that because of the litigation, or because of some of those experiences in the war zones? Or?
I hated the litigation. I said plenty of times that I'd rather be sheltering from sniper fire than be subjected to 3 days of cross-examination by a cold-blooded QC. And I mean that too. I mean, you know, look, I mean, I've done a lot of war reporting too, and I've been shot at, and I kind of understand. I've never carried a weapon, and I've never shot at anybody, but I understand that those situations can actually act as a stress release. You know, it's the adrenaline pumps, and as long as you don't do something really stupid, you don't come away from it feeling traumatized. You might come away from it feeling energized. I'm not a war junkie either. I don't like going to those places, and when I am in a situation where the bullets are flying, I'm extremely careful about what we do and where we go, and I'm very focused on me being there not to win a medal, but to actually get the story, and the story isn't going to be told if I get shot, and it's not necessarily best told from the most dangerous vantage point either. So you know, I've never, believe me, domestic investigative journalism is a hell of a lot tougher than war zone reporting. It requires a lot more moral courage. It requires a lot more fortitude, and that's why I hated this domestic litigation so much, because it was just a constant worry. And when it becomes to a battle of wits in the witness box, that's terrifying, because the people you're up against know that world so much better than you do. And no matter what they say about none of it being personal, it certainly feels like it is, and it certainly feels like what they're out to do is prove that you're everything you don't think you are. You know, you're a cheat and a liar.
Can I ask you about Jonestown?
Yeah, of course.
What was the kernel of that idea, deciding to write a book about Alan Jones, an unauthorised biography of Alan Jones?
Well, it's definitely another cab off the rank story. You know, it's definitely another case of me waking up one day and feeling that it would be gutless if I didn't do this story, but also knowing full well that it would be a rotten story to do.
Sounds like you're a sucker for punishment, Chris.
No, I just worked at Four Corners for a long time, and I did investigative journalism, and I took my work seriously. I'm maybe a little bit of a sucker for punishment. I mean, I think I could have protected myself a little bit better too. But it's easier to live with yourself. It's harder to live with yourself if you know you've ducked story after story after story. It would be for me anyway. And I wasn't going to duck this one. I mean, the Queensland. I'd done a lot of work on police and corruption, and there'd been a lot of reforms that had come into place. And there was a police commissioner brought in, Peter Ryan in New South Wales, who was honest. Nobody would say anything to the contrary. And he was beginning to be sidelined and run out of town by some pretty dark forces, I thought. And Alan Jones was at the centre of it. You know, why? And then I knew had heard this extraordinary story about how he'd been involved in a little movement to get rid of Peter Ryan, which the New South Wales Premier knew about. The new police minister was part of the deal. This cabal of people sort of met, and next thing you know, the police commissioner's been kicked out, and somebody from my own industry has been involved. You know, I didn't know that much about Alan Jones at that time, and I didn't care that much about him either. I didn't listen to his program, but I thought I'd seen evidence of abuse of power, and I'd been conditioned to confront abuse of power wherever I saw it. And the very fact that I was seeing it in my own industry, to me, made it even a bigger story, a more important story. But I knew I would have a lot of trouble from my own industry for taking him on. I didn't know that I would have so much trouble from my own employer, but there you go.
So the book was pitched and commissioned by ABC Books.
That's right. Initially, I think this happens at a low level in the organisation. The managing director isn't signing off on something like this. I had written a book, and it had been published with ABC Books, and they wanted me to write another one. And this was just at the time that this stuff had all happened. And I sort of took a deep breath and said, really, you know, an unauthorised biography of Alan Jones is really crying out to be done, because, you know, you could write 4 of them, because you could write about Alan Jones, the rugby coach. You could write about Alan Jones, the political figure, the former speechwriter to a prime minister. You could write about his controversial career as a teacher, and of course you could write about his phenomenal rise in radio. So, you know, it was rich pickings. Did I leave out the rugby coach? He was a rugby coach as well. And anyway, I think it was obvious to them that it was a good story, but nobody really thought through the difficulties of what might happen way down the track. And look, as I got into that process and I started to put the story together, and I started to gather the evidence, and the lawyers started to get involved, they started to ask me for more evidence to back up what I was doing. So I had to dig a little bit further and find witnesses, more witnesses. Most of this stuff I got attacked for going over the top about talking about Alan Jones being gay. You know, I might have gone over the top a little bit about that too when I think back on it. But I tell you what, the lawyers had a certain role in that. You know, not that it was ever defamatory to say he was gay, but But they were so fixed on it that they kept asking me to find more and more evidence. If I was going to sort of say he was gay, you know, they wanted to find more and more evidence of it. So, you know, the fact that so much of that found its way into the book is obviously significantly my fault, but it's not only my fault.
Mm-hmm. And at what point did ABC Books decide that they didn't want to go ahead with the project?
Right at the 11th hour. I'm very dirty at the way that was done. I think they were rotten to me, and I'd been a very loyal employee of the ABC for a long time. I think at some level they recognised that, but they never had the guts to come to me and say, "Chris, this was a mistake. This book shouldn't have been commissioned by us. It's fine if some commercial publisher runs it, but the political sensitivities, the Prime Minister of the day being close to Alan Jones, you know, for the ABC to be writing a critical account of a rival broadcaster, when all things are considered, technically, politically, it was a mistake." No, they didn't say that to me. They gave me a ridiculous, you know, contradictory account of why they were. That they were saying that they thought the book would be a phenomenal commercial success, but the prospective litigation costs were, you know, on the one hand they were saying it was going to cost them a lot of money, on the other hand they were saying it was going to make them a lot of money. So, and there wasn't a commercial publisher in Australia that didn't want the book, you know. So none of that made sense. The fact is that they were just gutless, and the fact is they did me a favour. But what I really hate about it was the way they went about it. You know, they tried to punish me for about 12 months into giving up and me taking the book away from them. That is what I believe the strategy was, because for pretty much, you know, let's say 12 months at the 11th hour, I'm going through a punishing process with the lawyers, talking about what we can and can't say. They're asking me to gather more evidence. They're sometimes seems to me to be asking ridiculous things, and I think the game was for me to be get fed up with them and bail out. But I kept doing what they asked me to do. I kept finding the evidence and saying, okay, well, if you need it, here it is. And I think I without knowing what I was doing, I painted them into a corner, and they didn't have an excuse to abandon the project, so they had to just finally admit to me that they, with the limp excuse that they could muster, that they were walking away from it.
What was your next move?
I didn't have to do much at all. I just had lots of publishers ringing me up wanting the book.
Right.
Yeah.
So you went for the highest bidder? No,
I didn't go to the highest bidder. I went to Allen and Unwin. I'd thought of the ABC as like a family. I'd worked at Four Corners for most of my professional life, and I thought of Four Corners as like a family. I thought of the ABC like a family. And then all of a sudden, the family had divorced me, and so I think I was attracted to familial ties. I wanted to go somewhere where I felt like I was wanted and trusted. That's why I ended up at Allen and Unwin. I had a few offers from other publishers. Penguin would have been a good publisher to go with, and there were more too. And it wasn't the biggest offer. The other factor was there was a good Allen and Unwin office near where I worked, so you know, it's hard to work for a publisher if they're on the other side of the country or the other side of the world.
And was that book subject to litigation, or were you...
Oh no, it was subject to litigation, and it did have some mistakes in it too. It's very hard to write a book that's that big, you know, in the circumstance I was doing it, which is without his involvement. I asked for his involvement, and I welcomed it right up till the end.
Was he ever even slightly inclined to cooperate with you?
We did. We communicated, and at one point, an offer was put to me by John Singleton, who was his boss. I'm not sure who's the boss, but he worked with John Singleton, and anyway, I presumed that the offer came with strings that weren't. There were a lot of money. A lot of money was suggested.
Right.
Yeah.
So it could have been an authorised biography, or in a sense. But
we didn't get far enough into negotiations to really nail that down, but certainly a lot of money was offered, and at that point I said, I presume that this means that Alan will have to sign off on this, and there wasn't an answer to that. But anyway, it didn't go any further.
What year was that book published?
2006.
You wrote about Alan again early this year with the Saturday paper, so he's still tickling away at the back of your mind there. Or are you still interested in him? Perhaps?
No, well, I'm not that interested in him. And look, the Saturday paper have asked me to write that story for years. And to be frank, I just ran out of excuses. I didn't want to write it. It's something of a pain to be an expert on some of the world's greatest shitheads. And but I did have some things that I thought were worth saying too, and I put them into the column. In the end, I just, as I say, I ran out of excuses, and I thought, well, I'm just going to have to write it.
It was a good piece. I read it again last night. I think.
Thank you.
Very
There's
nice.
a prescient little paragraph in there about Turnbull and Mike Baird.
Yes, indeed. Okay, coming towards the end, what sustains you and your interest in journalism now, Chris, having done it for 40 plus years?
I don't know that I'm that good at anything else. I find, as much as I still love books, I'm not that much of an expert on literature, but I love stories. I love getting to the bottom of something, and I love feeling like the exercise was worthwhile. I think that nobody owns a story. We all have equity in them, and the critical job of the journalist is to form that narrative, to make the story meaningful, and for improve everyone's understanding. So it's a form of public education which I'm attracted to, always have been.
Your appetite for the work has not diminished?
No, well, actually, that's sort of the problem. I was always enthusiastic about whatever story I did. When I did that story on transfer pricing, if anybody asked me what I was doing on, I'd download with great enthusiasm, and I'd tell them all this stuff, and they'd look at me and blink. So whatever story I'm doing is the best story I've ever done. It's a great attitude to have in journalism, and that's not changed at all. I still get ridiculously enthusiastic about what I'm hearing and what I'm processing in my own mind. The trouble is, I'm 66, and I still think exactly the way I did when I was 26. So here I am in Brisbane, and I will work. I worked all this morning, and I'll work late into the night, and I'm just not up to it anymore.
Well, that's inspiring for me to hear.
Thank you.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you?
Well, maybe, but you've got out of me a lot more than I was initially prepared to surrender.
It's been great to talk to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Chris Masters. You can find show notes to this episode at penmanshippodcast.com. You can also send me feedback on the podcast in general. I'd love to hear from you via email, andrew@penmanshippodcast.com, or on Twitter @penmanshipau. If you'd like to support Penmanship, the best way to do so is to share it with friends, colleagues and family who appreciate great Australian writing. You can also leave a review on iTunes, which would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening. Until next time.